On the evening of March 15th, 1814, the candles of the Pembroke ballroom blazed with the promise of a new season, their light catching the silver embroidery of Lady Beatrice Ashworth's pale blue silk gown as she stood beside her cousin Georgiana near the tall windows overlooking the gardens. And though the room swelled with the sounds of violins and conversation and the rustle of 100 silk gowns, Beatrice heard none of it, had heard nothing since the scarlet fever stole her hearing at 7 years old, and now at 24 she had perfected the art of watching, of reading the shapes of words on lips, of catching meaning in the arch of an eyebrow or the subtle tightening of a gloved hand. And she watched now as Lady Caroline Hastings leaned toward her companion, their fans raised in that particular way that meant secrets were being shared. And Beatrice read the words as clearly as if they had been shouted across the room. There she is, the Ashworth tragedy, 4 seasons and not a single offer. What gentleman wants a wife who cannot hear him? And though she had long since stopped expecting kindness from the ton, the words still found their mark, still pressed against the old bruise she carried beneath her pearl necklace, the strand that had belonged to her grandmother, who had believed in her when no one else did. Georgiana touched her elbow and signed quickly, her hands shielded from view by the angle of their bodies. What did she say? And Beatrice signed back. Nothing of consequence, which was both true and a lie, for Lady Caroline's cruelty was as predictable as the sunrise, and therefore held no surprise, even if it still carried the power to wound. Her father, the Duke, stood across the room in conversation with Lord Pembroke, his eyes flicking toward her with that expression she had come to know so well, protective and desperate and sad. For she knew he blamed himself for the fever, for the silence that had swallowed her world. And she knew, too, that this would be her final season, that after this she would retire to the country estate and live out her days among her sketchbooks and her silence. And there was a kind of peace in that resignation, a surrender that felt almost like freedom. Georgiana suddenly straightened beside her, her fingers spelling rapidly. Something is happening. The crowd is parting, and Beatrice looked toward the entrance of the ballroom, where indeed the guests were drawing back like waves from a shore, their faces transforming into expressions of surprise and delight and obsequious pleasure. And though she could not hear the announcement that rippled through the room, she read it on a dozen lips simultaneously. The king has arrived. His Majesty, King Frederick. And Beatrice felt her heart quicken, not with excitement, but with the familiar desire to disappear, for royal attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant pity, and pity was the one thing she could no longer bear. The king entered the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water, and Beatrice watched the ripples spread outward through the crowd, the curtsies and bows cascading in waves she could see but not hear announced. And in that moment of universal distraction, she saw her chance to escape, to slip away from the cruel whispers and the pitying glances and the weight of being the Ashworth tragedy on display for yet another season. And so she moved quietly along the edge of the room, her pale blue silk brushing against the wall. As she made her way toward the alcove, near the tall windows where heavy velvet curtains offered a sanctuary of shadow, and she settled onto the small bench there, half hidden from view, with only the candelabra on the nearby table casting its flickering light upon her hands folded in her lap. And she did not know that across the room King Frederick V was enduring the performance of his own role, accepting the congratulations and well-wishes of nobles who saw in him only a crown to be courted and a throne to be influenced, and he smiled as duty demanded, while inside he felt the familiar weariness that had settled into his bones since ascending 3 years ago, since losing Charlotte, 10 years before that, since learning that royalty meant performing rather than living, and his eyes moved across the ballroom, not seeking admirers but seeking escape. And that was when he noticed the woman in pale blue sitting alone in the alcove, noticed her because she was the only person in the room who had not turned toward his entrance, who sat with her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window, as if the arrival of a king meant nothing at all. And he found himself intrigued by this singular indifference, this quiet rebellion against the theatre of court life. And he watched her for a long moment while pretending to listen to Lord Pembroke discuss taxation. Watched as she lifted her hands and began to move them in patterns that struck him like lightning through his chest. Patterns he had not seen in 16 years. Patterns that belonged to another lifetime, when he was simply Frederick and his little sister Charlotte would sit beside him in the nursery and teach him the language of her hands because she could not hear his voice. And the woman in the alcove signed to herself with the unconscious grace of one who believed herself unobserved, her fingers forming words he still remembered, though he had tried so hard to forget. And he saw her sign something that looked like frustration, like resignation. And without quite deciding to do so, he excused himself from Lord Pembroke and began to move toward the alcove, toward this stranger who spoke his sister's language, who sat in silence while the world around her roared with sounds she could not hear. And he did not announce himself, did not speak, simply stood in the shadows at the edge of the curtain and watched her hands move through the candlelight, his heart beating with a strange and painful hope he had not felt since he was 12 years old. And Charlotte was still alive. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Beatrice sat alone in the alcove, her fingers moving through the silent air as she spoke to herself in the language that had become her refuge, the language her grandmother had insisted she learn after the fever took her hearing, and she signed the words without thinking, without caution, because she believed herself invisible in this shadowed corner, while the glittering world of the tun danced and laughed and judged beyond the velvet curtains. And her hands formed the shapes of her frustration. Why do I even try? And then the deeper truth she rarely admitted even to herself. Nobody sees me. Nobody has ever truly seen me. And her fingers continued their silent confession as she thought of her grandmother. Gone these 5 years now, the only person who had looked at her deafness not as a deficiency, but as simply another way of being in the world. And she signed into the empty air, "I love you, grandmother, but your faith in me was misplaced. There is no place for me here, no gentleman who will look past the silence to find me." And she did not see Frederick standing at the edge of the curtain, did not see how his face had gone pale as milk, did not see the way his hands had begun to tremble at his sides as memories crashed over him like waves against a shore, memories of Charlotte sitting in the nursery window signing the same phrase, I love you, Frederick, promise you will always understand me." And he had promised, had spent hours learning every sign she taught him, had been the only one in the entire palace who could speak with her in her own language, and now, here in this ballroom. After her death, a stranger was signing in the candlelight, and something cracked open inside his chest that he had kept sealed since he was 12 years old, and before he could stop himself, before he could consider the consequences, or the protocol, or the 1,000 reasons he should walk away, his hands rose and formed the signs he had not made in over a decade. "You are not alone." And Beatrice saw the movement from the corner of her eye and turned with such startled swiftness that she nearly knocked the candelabra from the table. And there he stood, a tall figure emerging from the shadows, his face half illuminated by the flickering light, and she could see that he was handsome and finely dressed. But she could not see the military decorations clearly enough to identify his rank, could not know that his signet ring bore the royal crest, could only see his hands still held in the position of his message, and she stared at him with an expression of such profound shock that for a moment neither of them moved, and then her hands lifted slowly, trembling slightly, and she signed back, "You understand me?" And he stepped closer into the light and signed, "I understand you." And in the ballroom beyond their hidden alcove, a waltz played on while something far more significant than music passed between them in the silence. They stood together in the alcove as the clock somewhere in the ballroom chimed 9, though Beatrice could not hear it, could only see the slight shift in his attention, as if some sound had reached him from beyond their curtained sanctuary. And she studied his face in the candlelight, with the careful attention she had learned to give to every visual detail, since the fever had stolen her hearing at 7 years old, and she saw that he was perhaps 4 or 5 years older than her own 24, with dark hair and eyes that held something she recognized, something that looked like loneliness wearing the mask of composure. And her hands lifted to sign the question that burned in her chest. "Who are you, and how do you know my language?" And he smiled then, a real smile that transformed his features from handsome to beautiful, and his hands moved in response. "I learned from someone I loved very much, someone who could not hear the world either." And Beatrice felt her breath catch, because there was grief in those signs, grief worn smooth by years of carrying it, and she wanted to ask more, but something stopped her, some instinct that recognized a wound too tender for a stranger's touch. And so instead she signed, "I lost my hearing when I was 7. Scarlet fever." And he nodded as if he had guessed as much, and then his eyes dropped to her hands, and she saw him notice the ink stain on her fingers, the permanent mark of someone who spent hours with pen and paper. And he signed, "You write," and she signed back, "I draw, I paint. It is easier to show the world through images than to try to speak to people who do not wish to listen." And something flickered across his face at that, something like understanding or perhaps recognition. And she noticed then the scar on the back of his hand, a thin white line that curved from his knuckle to his wrist, and she almost asked about it. But he was signing again, asking her name. And she hesitated because names meant families, and families meant titles, and titles meant the complicated dance of society that had rejected her so thoroughly. And so she signed, simply, "Beatrice, just Beatrice." And he accepted this with a slight inclination of his head, and signed back, "Then I shall be just Frederick." And they moved deeper into the alcove without quite deciding to do so, drawn toward each other by the magnetic pull of mutual understanding. And Beatrice found herself closer to this stranger than she had ever stood to any man outside her family, close enough to see the individual threads of gold embroidery on his coat, close enough to smell sandalwood and something else, something clean like winter air. And she should have been afraid, or at least cautious, but instead she felt only a profound and startling sense of peace. If she had been searching for something her entire life, and had finally, impossibly, found it in the shadowed corner of a ballroom, while a waltz she could not hear played on and on beyond the velvet curtains. The moment shattered like glass when a voice cut through the velvet curtain of their sanctuary, a voice that carried the weight of authority and deference in equal measure. And Beatrice saw Frederick's expression change, saw the warmth drain from his features to be replaced by something formal and distant. And then the curtain was pulled aside, and a man in elaborate court dress stood there, with his head bowed and his words reaching Beatrice only as shapes on his lips. "Your Majesty, the ambassador awaits your attention." And the world stopped spinning on its axis as the words registered in her mind, "Your Majesty." And she looked at Frederick, at just Frederick who had signed with her in the candlelight and shared the grief of someone lost. And she saw now what she had missed before. The military decorations that marked him as more than a soldier, the signet ring that bore the royal crest, the way the courtier held himself with the rigid posture of a man addressing his sovereign. And horror flooded through her veins like ice water as she understood that she had been speaking intimately with the King of England, had been standing close enough to smell his cologne, had been sharing secrets with the man who ruled the nation. And she stumbled backward, her hip catching the edge of the table and sending the candelabra wobbling dangerously. And Frederick turned to her with something desperate in his eyes, and his hands rose quickly to sign, "Please, don't go." But she was already retreating, already feeling the heat of humiliation burning up her neck and across her cheeks, and she signed back with trembling fingers, "I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." And then she was pushing past the velvet curtains and into the bright chaos of the ballroom, her grandmother's handkerchief slipping from her sleeve as she fled, the delicate linen with its embroidered initials falling to the floor unnoticed by her, but not by Frederick, who bent to retrieve it as the Lord Chamberlain waited with barely concealed impatience, and he pressed the handkerchief to his palm and felt the raised threads of B.A. against his skin as he watched her disappear into the crowd. And he could not follow, could not chase after her without causing a scandal that would destroy her reputation and his own carefully maintained dignity. And so he stood there with her handkerchief hidden in his fist, while his face settled into the mask of royal composure he had worn since ascending to the throne 3 years ago. And across the ballroom, Georgiana finally spotted her cousin emerging from the shadows with tears streaming down her face and an expression of absolute terror. And near the refreshment table, Lady Caroline Hastings lowered her fan and watched the scene unfold with the sharp, predatory interest of a woman who collected secrets like others collected jewels. And she had seen enough, had seen the king emerge from the same alcove moments after the deaf Ashworth girl, had seen the way he clutched something small and white in his hand, and she smiled to herself as she calculated the value of this particular piece of information. The morning of March 16th, 1814 arrived wrapped in grey rain that streaked the windows of Ashworth House like tears, and Beatrice sat in her private sitting room with her hair still loose around her shoulders and her morning dress only half buttoned, staring at the sketchbook open on her lap, where her hands had moved without conscious thought during the sleepless hours of the night, tracing the outline of a shadowy figure, a man emerging from darkness with his hands raised in the gesture that had changed everything. And she could not stop replaying every moment in her mind, the way his fingers had moved with such fluency, the way his eyes had held hers without pity or condescension, the way he had asked her name and offered his own as if they were equals, meeting at a country dance rather than a king conversing with a woman. Society considered broken, and she pressed her palms against her eyes until colours burst behind her lids because she had made such a fool of herself, had stood too close and shared too much, and then fled like a startled rabbit when she learned who he truly was. And what must he think of her now? The deaf duke's daughter, who could not even recognize her own sovereign, and she was still sitting there when the door opened and Georgiana swept in with her face flushed with excitement and her hands already moving in rapid signs, demanding to know what had happened last night, why Beatrice had run through the ballroom with tears on her cheeks. And Beatrice tried to explain, but how could she make Georgiana understand when she barely understood it herself? So she wrote it out instead, filling page after page of her notebook with the story of the alcove and the candlelight and the stranger who signed back. And Georgiana's eyes grew wider with each revelation until she was clutching Beatrice's hands and signing, "This is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." And Beatrice shook her head because romance was not for women like her. Romance was for the whole and the hearing and the beautiful. But before she could argue further, there was a knock at the door and a footman entered, bearing a silver tray on which rested an envelope of cream-coloured paper sealed with red wax that bore the unmistakable imprint of the royal crest. And Beatrice felt her heart stop as her father appeared behind the footman with an expression of bewildered pride, announcing that the family had received an invitation to attend the royal garden party on the 22nd of March, a rare honour that could not possibly be refused. And Beatrice wanted to scream that she could not go, could not face him again, could not bear to be recognized, as the girl who did not know her own king, but her father was already speaking of gowns and protocol and opportunity, and Georgiana was squeezing her hand with barely contained excitement. And somewhere across London, in a palace Beatrice had never seen, a man she had known for only 15 minutes was holding her grandmother's handkerchief and planning how to find her again. The royal study on the afternoon of March 18th, 1814, was bathed in pale spring light that filtered through tall windows and fell across the mahogany desk where King Frederick V sat, surrounded by papers he had not read and correspondence he had not answered, his attention fixed instead on the small square of linen he turned over and over in his fingers, tracing the embroidered initials B.A. with his thumb, as if the letters themselves might reveal the secrets of the woman who had fled from him 3 nights ago. And behind him on the wall hung the portrait of Princess Charlotte, painted when she was 10 years old, her dark eyes bright with mischief, her small hands folded in her lap in a pose that hid the way those hands had moved with such grace and speed when she signed. and Frederick did not need to turn around to feel his sister's presence in the room, because she was always there, always watching, always reminding him of the promise he had failed to keep. And the door opened without warning, as only one person in the kingdom dared to do. And Dowager Queen Eleanor swept into the study with the rustle of black silk and the faint scent of lavender that had surrounded Frederick's childhood like a suffocating cloud, and she settled into the chair across from his desk with the air of a woman who expected to be obeyed, and said that it was time they discussed his duty to the crown, his duty to provide an heir, his duty to choose a bride from among the suitable candidates she had compiled on the list she now placed before him, princesses from Prussia and Austria and Denmark, women of impeccable lineage and perfect health, and, she emphasized with a pointed look, no unfortunate deficiencies that might complicate the succession. And Frederick felt the old familiar anger rise in his chest, because he knew what she meant by deficiencies, knew that she had never forgiven Charlotte for being born different, had kept his sister hidden away in distant chambers where her silence would not embarrass the court, and he had been too young and too powerless to protect her, had watched her grow pale and thin and desperately lonely until the consumption took her at 12 and left him with nothing but her sketchbook full of drawings and the language she had taught him that he had never spoken since, until 3 nights ago, until a woman in a pale blue gown had signed to herself in the candlelight and broken open something inside him that he had thought was sealed forever. And so instead of answering his mother, he pulled a different document from beneath the stack of royal correspondence, a report from his private secretary listing every deaf daughter of noble families in England, and there, third from the bottom, was the name Lady Beatrice Ashworth, daughter of the Duke of Ashworth, age 24, deaf since childhood, unmarried, and Frederick pressed his palm against Charlotte's handkerchief and made a silent vow that he would find her again, would speak to her again in the language of his heart, would ensure that the garden party invitations went out that very afternoon with the Ashworth family prominently included, because he had failed one woman who spoke with her hands, and he would not, could not, fail another. The royal gardens on the afternoon of March 22nd, 1814, spread before Beatrice like a watercolor painting come to life, all soft greens and bursting roses and elegant figures moving across manicured lawns beneath a sky of pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud. And she stood beside her father in her green silk dress with its cream spencer buttoned to her throat, feeling as though every eye in the kingdom was searching for her among the hundreds of guests who strolled and chatted and laughed in sounds she could not hear, and Georgiana stayed close at her elbow with her hands ready to interpret any conversation that might arise, though Beatrice prayed no conversation would arise because she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the hedgerows and remain hidden until this terrible afternoon ended, and she could return to the safety of her room where no king could find her, and no memories of candlelit alcoves could torment her. But her father had other plans entirely, and guided her through the crowd with his hand firm on her arm, presenting her to Lord This and Lady That, with the desperate pride of a man trying to sell a flawed diamond by emphasizing the brilliance of its facets. And Beatrice smiled and nodded and let Georgiana speak for her, while she read lips and pretended not to notice the pitying glances and whispered comments that followed in their wake. And then a man in a red waistcoat appeared before them, with a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that calculated her worth like a merchant assessing livestock. And her father introduced him as Lord Thomas Sinclair, heir to the Earl of Westbrook, and Lord Thomas bowed over her gloved hand and said something to her father that made the Duke beam with pleasure, and Georgiana's hands moved reluctantly to interpret. He says he has heard much about you and finds your condition far less troubling than rumor suggested. He says a quiet wife might suit him well. He says he would be willing to overlook your deficiency in light of your family connections. And Beatrice felt the familiar cold anger settle in her chest, but kept her expression serene, because she had learned long ago that showing emotion only gave them more to whisper about. And she nodded politely while Lord Thomas continued speaking about his estate, and his prospects, and his generous willingness to consider her, despite her obvious limitations, and all the while she felt something prickling at the back of her neck, a sensation of being watched that had nothing to do with the curious stares of society matrons. And when she finally allowed herself to glance toward the elevated platform where the royal throne sat beneath a canopy of white silk, she saw him, King Frederick V, in his formal coat with gold braid catching the afternoon sun, and his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And for one suspended moment, the garden party disappeared, and there was only the memory of his hands moving in the language of her heart, signing words that no one else in this glittering crowd would understand. And then Lord Thomas touched her arm to reclaim her attention, and the spell shattered, leaving Beatrice trapped between a future she dreaded and a hope she dared not name. The wisteria arbour at the far edge of the royal gardens on the afternoon of March 22nd, 1814, hung heavy with purple blooms that cast dappled shadows across the gravel path where Beatrice had fled to escape Lord Thomas Sinclair's calculating smile and her father's desperate hope and the weight of 100 curious stares that pressed against her skin like physical things. And she sank onto the cold stone bench beneath the cascading flowers and pressed her palms against her eyes and tried to breathe through the tightness in her chest, telling herself that she simply needed a moment, just one quiet moment away from the endless performance of being the Duke's deaf daughter, the pitiable creature, the burden to be overlooked or tolerated or, worst of all, generously accepted despite her obvious flaws, and she was so lost in her own misery that she did not feel the vibration of footsteps on the gravel path, did not sense the presence behind her until a hand touched her shoulder, with such gentleness that she gasped and spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, and there he stood, in the golden afternoon light with his dark hair slightly dishevelled, and his formal coat unbuttoned at the throat, as if he too had needed to escape something. And before she could remember to curtsy or flee or do any of the things a woman should do when confronted by her sovereign, his hands began to move in the language that lived inside her, like music lives inside those who can hear. And he signed, "I have been looking for you." And Beatrice felt the world tilt beneath her feet, because those hands, those royal hands that signed treaties and commanded armies and held the fate of nations, were speaking to her in the only language that had ever felt like home. And she found her own hands rising to respond before her mind could stop them, signing, "Why? Why would you look for me?" And he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a square of linen embroidered with her initials and pressed it into her trembling fingers, signing, "You left this behind, and I could not bear to let it be the only piece of you I possessed." And something cracked open inside her chest, something dangerous and terrifying and wonderful. And she signed, "You are the king. You cannot speak to me like this. You cannot look at me like this. There are guards watching and courtiers gossiping, and your mother surely has princesses lined up for your inspection." And Frederick smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. And he signed, "I did not want to be the king that night at the ball. I wanted to be just Frederick, a man who found a woman speaking the language of his childhood and felt less alone for the first time in 16 years. And Beatrice clutched the handkerchief against her heart and stared at this impossible man on this impossible afternoon and wondered how she was supposed to protect herself from hoping when he kept saying things that made her want to believe. The sun hung low over the royal gardens on the late afternoon of March 22nd, 1814, casting everything in shades of amber and rose as the garden party guests began their slow migration toward the gates. And Beatrice sat beside Frederick on the cold stone bench beneath the wisteria arbour, with her gloves removed and folded in her lap so that her bare hands could speak more freely, and she watched his face as he began to sign with movements that had grown slower, heavier, as though each gesture cost him something precious. And he signed her name was Charlotte. She was my younger sister, born when I was 4 years old, and perfect in every way, except that she could not hear the lullabies our mother sang or the stories our father told, and Beatrice felt her breath catch because she had not known. No one had ever mentioned a deaf princess. And Frederick continued signing, with his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond her shoulder, The court wanted to hide her away, to pretend she did not exist. But I refused to let her be invisible. I learned to speak with my hands so that she would never feel alone, so that she would know at least one person in this vast, cold palace understood her. And his hands faltered for a moment before continuing. She was brilliant and funny, and she drew the most beautiful pictures of horses and gardens. And once she drew my portrait and made my nose far too large just to make me laugh. And Beatrice saw the grief etched into every line of his face, and understood suddenly why he had responded to her that night in the ballroom, why he had kept her handkerchief, why he had searched for her among all the guests at this party. And he signed she died when she was 12 years old. Consumption took her in the winter of 1802, and I held her hand until the very end, and the last thing she signed to me was, "Do not forget our language." And his voice broke on the word language, even though he spoke it aloud without realizing. And Beatrice reached out before she could stop herself, and placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin and the slight tremor that ran through him. And she signed with her free hand. She was lucky to have a brother who saw her as whole, who learned her language, who refused to let her be hidden away. And Frederick turned his hand beneath hers so that their palms pressed together. And he signed, "I was lucky to have her. She taught me that the most important conversations happen in silence, that connection does not require sound, that love speaks in whatever language the heart understands, and the golden light wrapped around them like a blessing." As the distant sounds of departing carriages faded into nothing, and Beatrice understood that this impossible man with his crown and his grief and his gentle hands had found in her an echo of what he had lost. And perhaps she had found in him the one person who would never ask her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The week that followed the royal garden party unfolded like a dream from which Beatrice feared she might wake at any moment. For on the morning of March 29th, 1814, she sat in her small studio at Ashworth House, surrounded by evidence of an impossible courtship that she still could not quite believe was real. And the spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated a collection of gifts that had arrived day after day, with notes written in a bold hand she had come to recognize instantly. And the first had been a leather-bound volume of botanical illustrations with a card tucked inside that read, "For eyes that see what others miss." And the second had been a set of watercolor pigments from Paris in shades of purple and gold that reminded her of wisteria. And the third had been a slim book of poetry, with certain passages marked by a careful hand, passages about silence and understanding, and the language of souls who need no words. And Beatrice traced her fingers over these treasures, and felt something dangerous blooming in her chest, something that looked terribly like hope. And Georgiana burst into the room with her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed, signing rapidly that the gossip columns were full of speculation about the king's mysterious interest in a certain Lady B, whose identity remained tantalizingly unclear, and downstairs the Duchess Maria had begun planning which gowns Beatrice should wear to upcoming events, while the Duke paced his study, torn between protective caution and desperate hope that his daughter might finally find happiness. And across London, in drawing-rooms and tea-parlours, Lady Caroline Hastings whispered poisonous theories about why the king would show attention to a defective creature unless it were some elaborate jest or charitable impulse certain to end in humiliation. And Lord Thomas Sinclair watched and waited with narrowed eyes, because he had seen Frederick touch Beatrice's shoulder in the garden, had seen the way the king's hands moved in strange patterns that seemed to mean something, and he could not understand what possible advantage a deaf woman could offer the crown, but he intended to discover it. And in her studio, Beatrice worked on a portrait she had begun in secret, a portrait of a girl with dark hair and laughing eyes and hands frozen forever in the sign for brother, painted entirely from Frederick's descriptions of Charlotte, because she wanted him to have something he had lost, a way to see his sister through new eyes. And as she added the final touches to the painting, she thought about the letter that had arrived that morning, the one that said simply, "I find myself counting the hours until I might see your hands speak again," and she pressed the paper against her heart and allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future she had long ago stopped believing could ever belong to someone like her. The crystal chandeliers of the Royal Opera House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of April 5, 1814, casting prismatic rainbows across the velvet-draped boxes where London's finest families had gathered, to see and be seen as much as to witness the Italian soprano whose voice Beatrice would never hear. And she sat in the Ashworth family box, wearing a gown of deep burgundy silk that Georgiana had insisted brought out the roses in her cheeks, though Beatrice suspected those roses owed more to the nervous flutter in her chest than to any trick of fabric, for she knew that Frederick had arranged their placement in this particular box, knew it from the angle that allowed her to look directly across the gilded expanse to where he sat in the royal box with the Dowager Queen Eleanor at his side, and when their eyes met across that glittering distance, she felt the same jolt of recognition that had struck her in the alcove at the Pembroke ball all those weeks ago, and she raised her opera glasses to her eyes as though studying the stage, but instead watched his hands as they rested on the velvet balustrade. And during the first intermission, when the audience stirred and chattered and moved about, Frederick turned toward her box and lifted his hands just enough that she could see through her glasses as he signed, "You are magnificent tonight," and her heart seized in her chest because anyone watching might see, might understand, might realize that the King of England was communicating in the silent language of the deaf with the Duke of Ashworth's damaged daughter, and indeed Lady Caroline Hastings had positioned herself in a box nearby and was watching with sharp, predatory eyes. And when Caroline rose and made her way toward the Ashworth box during the second intermission, Beatrice felt dread pooling in her stomach, and Caroline swept in with false sweetness dripping from her smile as she said loudly enough for surrounding boxes to hear, "How brave of you, Lady Beatrice, to attend the opera when you cannot possibly appreciate the music." And Beatrice read the cruel words on her painted lips and felt the familiar sting of public humiliation. But before she could respond, or Georgiana could intervene, a footman appeared at their box with a message that the king requested Lady Beatrice's presence in the royal antechamber, and Caroline's face went white with shock as Beatrice rose on trembling legs and followed the footman through corridors lined with gold leaf and portraits of monarchs past, until she reached a small private room where Frederick waited alone, and he signed, "I saw what she said to you, and I will not permit anyone to diminish you in my presence or out of it." And Beatrice signed back, "You cannot protect me from every whisper." And he stepped closer until she could see the fierce determination in his eyes as he signed, "Then I will give them something else to whisper about." And he took her hand and led her back to the royal box, where he seated her beside him for the final act, in full view of his mother's frozen disapproval and the entire gasping audience, and as the soprano reached her final triumphant note that Beatrice could not hear, she felt something far more powerful than music. She felt the impossible weight of a king's public declaration that she was worthy of standing at his side. The morning of April the 10th, 1814, dawned bright and clear as Beatrice stood in the private audience chamber of the royal palace, her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel its rhythm in her throat. And the room was smaller than she had expected, intimate even, with pale blue walls and tall windows that overlooked a private garden where early roses were just beginning to bloom, and she had been summoned by royal messenger at 9 that morning with a note that bore Frederick's personal seal and contained only the words, "I need to see you, and please come." And now she waited alone, because Georgiana had been asked to remain in an antechamber, and her parents had not been invited at all, and the impropriety of this private meeting should have alarmed her. But instead, she felt only a desperate yearning to see his face and watch his hands form the words that had become more precious to her than any spoken language she had ever known. And when the door opened and Frederick entered, wearing not his formal court attire, but a simple dark coat that made him look younger and less like a monarch, and more like the man who had first signed to her in that candlelit alcove, she felt her breath catch in her chest, and he crossed to her immediately and signed, "I could not wait another day, and I have something I must tell you." And she signed back, "You frightened me with your summons, because I thought perhaps you had reconsidered, or your mother had convinced you of my unsuitability, and his expression shifted to something fierce and tender all at once as he signed. My mother has tried, and she has failed, and she will continue to fail because I have made my choice, and I need you to understand what that means. And he took her hands in his, and she could feel the slight roughness of his palms and the warmth that seemed to radiate from his skin into hers, and he released her hands only to sign, I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer not as a subject to a king, but as Beatrice to Frederick, and as one heart to another, and she felt tears pricking at her eyes because no one had ever spoken to her this way. No one had ever looked at her as though her answer mattered more than treaties or alliances or the continuation of dynasties. And he signed, I have watched you move through a world that refuses to hear you, and I have seen you create beauty and meaning despite every obstacle placed in your path. And I have fallen so completely in love with you that I cannot imagine a future that does not include your hand speaking to mine across every breakfast table and every quiet evening for the rest of our lives. And she stood, frozen, as he reached into his pocket and withdrew not the emerald ring his mother had chosen, but a different ring entirely. A simple gold band, set with a pearl that reminded her instantly of her grandmother's necklace. And he signed this belonged to Charlotte. And I want you to have it. And I want you to be my wife and my queen and my partner in all things. And Beatrice looked at the ring, and then at his face, and felt the weight of everything she had believed about herself crumbling away like walls that had imprisoned her for 17 long years. She could not speak, and she could not move, and she could feel the tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at the ring that had belonged to a 12-year-old princess who had never lived to see her 13th birthday. And Frederick's hands remained steady as he held it toward her, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might refuse, the hope that she would not. And she thought of all the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of love, all the seasons she had endured knowing that no man would choose a wife who could not hear his voice or respond to his whispered endearments in the darkness of their marriage bed. And she thought of her mother's shame, and her father's desperate attempts to find her any match at all, and she thought of Lady Caroline's cruelty and Lord Thomas's condescending offer to overlook her deficiency, as though her deafness were a stain that required forgiveness. And then she thought of this man standing before her, this king who had learned an entire language of hands and gestures and silent words just to speak with a sister the world had dismissed, this man who had seen her signing to herself in an alcove and had responded not with pity or confusion, but with recognition. And she raised her trembling hands and signed, I am not what a queen should be, and the court will never accept me, and your mother will fight this with everything she has. And Frederick signed back, I am the king, and I choose my own queen, and I choose you. And she signed, but I cannot hear the music at balls, or the speeches at state dinners, or the cries of our children in the night. And he signed, then I will be your ears, as you will be my heart, and we will build a court where silence is not a deficiency, but simply another way of being. And she thought of Charlotte, who had died alone and isolated in a palace full of people who could not or would not learn to speak to her. And she understood that Frederick was not merely proposing marriage, but proposing a revolution, a transformation of everything the court believed about worthiness and wholeness and the proper attributes of a queen. And she looked again at the pearl ring that caught the light from the tall windows, and she thought of her grandmother, who had always believed she would find her place in the world, and she raised her hands one final time and signed, Yes, Frederick, yes, I will marry you, yes, I will be your wife and your queen and your partner. And the smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds that had covered the sky for 17 years, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though Charlotte herself had known it would one day belong to another woman who understood the weight of silence. And then Frederick pulled her into his arms and held her against his chest, and she could feel the vibration of his laughter, even though she could not hear it. And for the first time in her life, Beatrice Ashworth knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The news spread through London like wildfire carried on a spring wind, and by the afternoon of April the 10th, 1814, there was not a drawing-room or gentleman's club in the city that had not heard some version of the extraordinary tale, and Lady Caroline Hastings had been among the first to learn of the private audience at the palace, though she had not been told its outcome, and she had spent the hours since speculating with barely concealed venom about what possible interest a king could have in a woman who could not even hear him speak. And when the official announcement came at 6 that evening, delivered by royal herald to every major household of the ton, the shock that rippled through society was so profound that several ladies reportedly required smelling salts, and the Duchess Maria Ashworth wept openly when Georgiana signed the words to Beatrice, because she had spent 17 years believing her daughter would never marry, and now her daughter would be queen. And the Duke stood very still for a long moment before crossing the room to embrace his child, with a ferocity that spoke of every fear he had carried, and every prayer he had whispered into the darkness of sleepless nights. And Georgiana laughed and cried simultaneously, as she signed again and again, "You are to be queen. You are to be queen. Our Beatrice is to be queen." And Beatrice herself felt as though she were floating somewhere outside her own body, watching a scene from a play she had never imagined could be written about someone like her. And across London, Lord Thomas Sinclair crumpled the announcement in his fist and threw it into the fire with a curse that would have scandalized even the most hardened of his club companions. And Lady Caroline Hastings sat in stunned silence for perhaps the first time in her adult life, as she contemplated a future in which the woman she had mocked and dismissed would outrank every person in the kingdom save one. And at the palace, Frederick stood at his window, watching the lights of the city flicker to life as evening fell, and he touched the place on his chest where Charlotte's ring had rested for 16 years, and he thought of his sister, and how she would have loved Beatrice, and how perhaps somewhere beyond the veil of death she knew what he had done and approved, and the Dowager Queen Eleanor had received the news with a silence so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of her private chambers by several degrees. But Frederick had anticipated this, and had already sent word that he would brook no opposition, and that any attempt to interfere with his engagement would be met with consequences she would not enjoy. And in her studio at Ashworth House, Beatrice sat alone after her family had finally given her space, and she looked at the pearl ring on her finger, and then at the portrait of Charlotte she had painted from Frederick's descriptions, and she signed to the painted image, "Your brother chose me, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of his love and of the ring you wore." And outside her window, the spring evening settled over London like a benediction, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. The weeks that followed the announcement blurred together in a whirlwind of preparations and protocols and fittings and lessons that left Beatrice exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. And she found herself surrounded by seamstresses measuring every inch of her body for the wedding trousseau, and ladies-in-waiting assigned to teach her the intricacies of court etiquette, and ministers who spoke too quickly for her to read their lips until Frederick intervened and demanded they slow down or communicate through writing, and through it all she clung to the quiet moments when Frederick would dismiss everyone, and they would sit together in the palace gardens or his private study and speak only with their hands, their signed conversations flowing with an ease and intimacy that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in a foreign land. And she learned more about Charlotte during these stolen hours, as Frederick shared memories he had never told another soul, the way his sister had loved to draw flowers, and how she had invented her own signs for things the formal language did not cover, and how she had laughed without sound, but with her whole body shaking with joy. And Beatrice began to understand that in loving her, Frederick was not trying to replace Charlotte, but rather honoring her memory by refusing to let another deaf woman be diminished by a world that did not know how to listen with its eyes. And the Dowager Queen, Eleanor maintained her icy disapproval, but she had apparently recognized that her son would not be moved, and had shifted her strategy from outright opposition to pointed suggestions about how Beatrice might be taught to appear more normal at state functions. And Frederick had responded to these suggestions with a quiet fury that Beatrice had never seen in him before, signing to her afterward that his mother would learn to accept her as she was, or his mother would learn to hold her tongue. And Beatrice had felt a fierce rush of love for this man who defended her, not despite her deafness, but because he understood that her deafness was simply part of who she was, no more a deficiency than the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. And she threw herself into learning the duties of a queen with a determination that surprised even herself, studying the histories of past consorts and memorizing the names and faces of every ambassador and noble she would need to recognize, and practicing the precise angle of her head during formal ceremonies. And she painted late into the nights when sleep would not come, her brush capturing the transformation she felt happening within herself, as the woman who had believed herself destined for lonely spinsterhood became someone she barely recognized, someone who stood straighter and smiled more freely, and looked people in the eye without flinching from whatever judgment she might find there. And when she looked at the pearl ring on her finger, she no longer saw only Charlotte's ghost, but also her own future, stretching out before her like a garden path she had never known existed, leading toward a destination she had never dared to imagine, but now could not imagine living without. The morning of May 15th, 1814, dawned clear and golden over London, and Beatrice stood before the tall mirror in her chambers at Ashworth House, as a small army of attendants fussed over every detail of her wedding gown, and the silk was ivory rather than white, because Frederick had remembered her mentioning once that she found pure white too stark against her complexion, and the bodice was embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light like scattered stars, and around her throat she wore not the grand jewels that had been offered from the royal collection, but her grandmother's simple pearl necklace, because Frederick had understood without being told that she needed something of her old life to carry into her new one. And Georgiana stood nearby, signing encouragement whenever their eyes met in the mirror, her own gown of pale blue marking her as the principal attendant, and the Duchess, Maria, wept quietly in the corner while pretending she was not weeping at all, and Beatrice felt strangely calm, as if all the terror and uncertainty of the past weeks had burned away in the night, leaving only a clear, bright certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. And when the carriage arrived to take her to the cathedral, she climbed, inside with her father, who held her hand the entire journey, and signed to her with his free hand that he had never been prouder of anything in his life than he was of the woman she had become. And the streets were lined with people who had come to see the unusual bride their king had chosen. And Beatrice watched their faces through the carriage window, wondering what they thought of her, and then realizing with a start that she did not care, because the only opinion that mattered was waiting for her at the altar. And when they arrived at the cathedral, the doors seemed impossibly tall and the aisle impossibly long. But she walked it anyway with her chin held high and her eyes fixed on Frederick, who stood at the far end in his formal regalia, looking less like a king than like a man watching his whole world approach him step by step. And when she reached him, he signed before the entire assembled nobility and foreign dignitaries and clergy. The words, "You are beautiful," and she signed back, "You are everything." And the Archbishop began the ceremony speaking words she could not hear, but Frederick had arranged for an interpreter to stand nearby, signing each phrase so she would miss nothing of her own wedding. And when the moment came for vows, Frederick spoke his aloud for the congregation, but also signed them directly to her so that she received them twice over. And when she made her own vows, she signed them while Georgiana spoke them aloud, and her hands did not tremble even once. And when Frederick slipped the ring onto her finger, it was not the grand emerald his mother had wanted, but a simple band of gold set with a single pearl that matched her necklace. And when he kissed her, the cathedral erupted in cheers she could not hear, but could feel vibrating through the stone floor beneath her feet. And she was no longer Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the deaf duke's daughter, but Queen Beatrice, and the world would never look at her the same way again. The days that followed the wedding passed in a blur of state banquets and formal receptions, and private moments stolen between obligations. And Beatrice found herself growing into her new role with a grace that surprised everyone except Frederick, who had never doubted her for a moment, and she learned to read the subtle currents of court politics through careful observation of faces and gestures and the way people positioned themselves in rooms. And she discovered that her years of watching rather than hearing had given her an advantage in understanding what people truly meant beneath their polished words, and the Dowager Queen Eleanor maintained her distance, but had ceased her open opposition after witnessing the way foreign ambassadors responded to Beatrice's quiet dignity and the genuine affection the common people showed their new queen whenever she appeared in public. And Beatrice established a school for deaf children in the city, funded by her own allowance, where they could learn to sign and read and write and discover that their silence was not a prison, but simply a different way of moving through the world. And Frederick supported every initiative she proposed, and often visited the school himself, signing with the children who stared at their king with wonder that a man of such power would speak their language. And on quiet evenings, they would sit together in the private apartments that had once belonged to Princess Charlotte, and Beatrice would show Frederick her latest paintings, while he shared the burdens of ruling that he could confide to no one else. And their hands moved in constant conversation, even when servants were present, because they had developed their own private signs that no one else could interpret. And when summer arrived, they retreated to the country estate where Frederick had spent childhood summers with Charlotte, and he showed Beatrice the tree where he and his sister had carved their initials, and the pond where she had loved to watch the swans, and the hidden garden where she had drawn her flowers. And Beatrice added her own initials beside Charlotte's on the tree, and painted the swans for Frederick's study, and planted new roses in the hidden garden so that something living would mark Charlotte's memory. And in the autumn, Beatrice discovered she was carrying their first child, and Frederick wept when she told him, signing through his tears, that he had never imagined such happiness was possible for him, and the Dowager Queen Eleanor softened visibly at the news and began offering advice about nurseries and wet nurses that Beatrice accepted with more patience than she might have shown before. And Lady Caroline Hastings, who had once whispered about deficiency and pity, now sought invitations to every royal event and spoke of Queen Beatrice as a dear friend, though Beatrice remembered every cruel word and simply smiled and signed to Frederick when they were alone, that some people carried their own deafness in their hearts, and Lord Thomas Sinclair had married a foreign countess and moved abroad, where Beatrice hoped he might learn that worth could not be measured in the absence of limitations, but only in the presence of character. The winter of 1815 brought snow that blanketed London in white silence, and Beatrice found a particular beauty in the way the world outside her window matched the quiet world inside her mind. And in February her daughter was born, with a cry that Beatrice could not hear, but could see in the way the infant's face reddened, and her tiny fists clenched against the shock of cold air. And Frederick was there holding Beatrice's hand through the entire labour, because he had refused to wait in another room as tradition demanded, and had told the physicians that if they had objections, they could take them up with their king. And when he placed the baby in Beatrice's arms, he signed with tears streaming down his face, "We will call her Charlotte if you agree." And Beatrice nodded, because she had known from the moment she learned she carried a girl that there could be no other name. And the Dowager Queen Eleanor came to see her granddaughter that same day, and held the tiny princess with an expression Beatrice had never seen on her face before. And when she looked up at Beatrice, she said aloud and slowly, so that Beatrice could read her lips, "I was wrong about you, and I am sorry." And Beatrice signed back in response, "You loved your son and wanted his happiness, and now we both have what we wanted." And something shifted between them in that moment that would grow into genuine affection over the years that followed. And little Charlotte grew strong and healthy, and showed no signs of deafness, though Beatrice would have loved her exactly the same either way, and Frederick taught his daughter to sign before she could properly speak, so that she could talk to her mother without intermediaries. And by the time Charlotte was 3, she chattered constantly in both spoken words and signs, switching between them as naturally as breathing. and Beatrice painted her daughter dozens of times, capturing the way her copper hair caught sunlight and the mischievous sparkle in her eyes that reminded everyone of Princess Charlotte the Elder. And the school for deaf children that Beatrice had founded grew into 3 schools across the country, and then 5, and eventually a network that would outlast her lifetime. And she received letters from parents thanking her for giving their children futures they had never dared imagine. And Frederick continued to rule with wisdom and compassion, and Beatrice continued to advise him in their private signed conversations that no courtier could eavesdrop upon. And they had 2 more children after Charlotte, a son named Henry, who would one day inherit the throne, and a daughter named Eleanor, who had her grandmother's stubborn chin and her mother's artistic eye. And all 3 children grew up bilingual in speech and sign, and the court that had once whispered about deficiency now boasted of their progressive queen who had transformed how the nation thought about those who experienced the world differently. And Beatrice sometimes paused in the midst of ordinary moments to marvel at how far she had travelled from that lonely alcove at the Pembroke ball where she had signed to herself that nobody saw her. The years continued to unfold like the pages of a book Beatrice might have illustrated herself, each chapter bringing new joys and challenges that she met with the quiet strength that had always defined her, even when she had not recognized it in herself. And on the 10th anniversary of her marriage to Frederick, she stood in the gallery of the palace where her paintings now hung alongside works by masters from centuries past, and she traced her fingers over the frame of her favorite piece which depicted the alcove at the Pembroke ball where she had first signed to a stranger who turned out to be her destiny. And Frederick found her there, as he so often did when she grew contemplative, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind and signed against her shoulder. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, and also the saddest. And she turned in his embrace and signed back. I remember thinking you were either very kind or very strange, and she smiled because he had proven to be both in the best possible ways, and their children's laughter echoed somewhere in the distant corridors, though Beatrice felt it more than heard it in the vibrations through the floor and the way Frederick's attention shifted toward the sound. And she signed, "Go to them. I will follow," and he kissed her forehead before departing, because even after a decade, he never left her presence without some gesture of affection. And Beatrice remained alone in the gallery for a moment longer, looking at the portraits of Princess Charlotte that hung near her own paintings. And she signed to the girl in the portrait, "Your brother kept his promise to remember you, and I hope wherever you are, you can see how much you are still loved." And then she walked through the corridors of the palace that had become her home toward the sounds she could not hear but somehow always found. And she passed servants who bowed and courtiers who smiled, and she nodded to each of them with the gracious warmth that had made her beloved throughout the kingdom. And she thought of the girl she had been at 24, who had believed herself destined for invisibility and spinsterhood, and she wished she could reach back through time to tell that frightened young woman that the very thing she considered her greatest limitation would lead her to her greatest love. And she found her family in the private garden where Frederick was pretending to be a dragon, while Charlotte and Henry and Eleanor shrieked with delighted terror, and she sat on the bench where she had once sat with Frederick during a garden party, and felt the spring sunshine on her face. And she signed to her husband, "You make a very dignified dragon, Your Majesty," and he roared silently at her while their children collapsed in giggles, and in that moment Beatrice knew with perfect certainty that every painful season and every whispered insult and every moment of loneliness had been leading her here to this garden and this family and this life she had never dared to imagine. And she signed to no one in particular, because sometimes thoughts simply needed to be released into the world. I am not invisible, and I never was, and I am exactly where I was always meant to be.